In order to understand the story of Elizabeth and Essex, you first must understand the background of Elizabeth, most especially her parentage. Elizabeth's father was Henry VIII, a great king and a vibrant man. At the time he met Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, he was married to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish and very Catholic princess. But the 20 years of their marriage had produced only one child, Mary, and the king was obsessed with having a son. Into this scenario, Anne Boleyn returns from the court of France to become a lady-in-waiting to Catherine. Anne was thin, excitable, tart, and witty. She made gentleness and amiability appear insipid. The French ambassador du Bellay said that the king's infatuation for her was such that only God could abate his madness. For 6 years, Anne refused to gratify his passion, keeping the lustful and domineering king in a white heat of desire. But finally, when his divorce from Catherine was all but accomplished, she yielded to him. The marriage was performed secretly, so that the coming child might be heir to his father's throne. The marriage was celebrated in the dark of a winter's morning, but the coronation procession was made in brilliant weather. In her ruby wreath and her robes of glittering silver, she was a woman clothed with the sun. Anne was born on her way, the king's wife, crowned queen and gone with child. Her long-sustained effort had resulted in an enormous triumph. But her child proved to be a girl, Elizabeth. And from that hour, Anne's influence began to wane. 2 miscarriages diminished it further. Then, she discovered the king making love to her lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. She burst into a rage that brought on a premature labor, and she was delivered of a dead boy. In Sir John Neale's words, she miscarried of her savior. The queen was charged falsely with having committed adultery with 5 men, including her brother, and condemned on a verdict of high treason to be beheaded or burned alive at the king's pleasure. Anne fought valiantly to save her life and the birthright of her child. When Elizabeth ascended the throne years later, a Protestant refugee wrote to her of her mother, "Alas, I shall never forget the sorrow I felt when I saw the sainted queen, your mother, entreating the most serene king, your father, at Greenwich Palace." But her entreaties fell on deaf ears. And so it was that Henry VIII had the Queen of England, his second wife, born Anne Boleyn, put to death by beheading. In the next 21 years before she was crowned, Elizabeth had to survive her father's subsequent 4 wives, the death of her beloved half-brother Edward, imprisonment by her half-sister Mary, and the constant vagaries of royal politics. She hardly knew during that time when she was in favor and when not. And not in favor meant imprisonment and possible death. But she was smart and gifted and applied those abilities to her circumstances. Actually, this often fragile princess outwitted, outlived, and outlucked them all, and at the age of 25, she ascended the throne. But our story of the great love affair between Elizabeth, Queen of England, and Robert, Earl of Essex, takes place many years later, when Elizabeth has been on the throne for over 25 years and shown herself a master of statecraft, playing France and Spain against one another with considerable dexterity. Her unmarried state was a valuable asset because she could hold out the prospect of a matrimonial alliance while she indulged in diplomatic and other flirtations. With favored courtiers, the queen indulged in familiarities that showed an utter lack of delicacy. She loved to be adored and was easily prone to fits of jealousy. It was into this Elizabethan court that Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, entered. Essex, a handsome, charming youth with an open manner, boyish spirits, and words and looks of adoration, fascinated Elizabeth. This new star, rising with extraordinary swiftness, was suddenly seen to be shining alone in the firmament. The Queen and the Earl were never apart. There was a dangerous difference in their ages, but for one moment, it was the May of 1587. All was smooth and well. There were long talks, long walks, and rides to the woods. And in the evening, there was more talk and laughter, then music. At last, when the rooms at Whitehall were empty, they were left, the two alone, playing cards or other games. As one contemporary gossip tells us, as told to him by a member of Essex household, "My lord cometh not to his own lodging till birds sing in the morning." But Essex was not as successful on the battlefield as he was in court. It was not for lack of bravery, but rather because he was too great a romantic and too headstrong. The first infraction came when he disobeyed the Queen's orders and ran off to fight a counterattack on Spain. Then he entreated her to let him go to France to assist with the French king's campaign against the Spanish. Elizabeth finally consented. However, he showed himself hasty, rash, and thoughtless. His reputation was retrieved only by his personal bravery. Then, at the attack on Spain at the Bay of Cadiz, he was triumphant. While the honors of the sea fight went to Sir Walter Raleigh, Essex was the hero on shore. Essex returned, triumphant and glorious, the hero of the hour. But the blaze of popularity that surrounded the Earl was not to Elizabeth's liking. She truly did not approve of anyone being popular except herself. And so it went between them over the years, back and forth, quarrels and reconciliations. She would become furious when she thought he was philandering with the ladies at court or wasting the crown's money. He would become angry when she treated him with an indignity that was unbearable to his sense of honor. But it was as a result of the Irish campaign that their relationship changed forever. Tyrone, the leader of the rebels in Ulster, led an attack that laid all of Northern Ireland open to the rebels. It was the most serious reverse that Elizabeth had suffered in the whole of her reign. Then Essex offered his services, and they were accepted. For Essex, it was obvious an Irish victory was vital. Would he achieve one? Francis Bacon was not the only observer at court to be pessimistic on that subject. When he arrived in Ireland, he immediately faced a question of crucial importance. Should he at once proceed to Ulster and dispose of Tyrone? Or should he first suppress the smoldering disaffection in the other parts of the island? It would be easier, he decided, to deal with the main forces of the rebellion when its supports had been demolished. But as he went forward, he encountered something more dangerous than resistance. The soft, insidious, undermining atmosphere of that paradoxical country. All was vague, contradictory, and unaccountable. And Essex, like so many others before and after him, began to catch the surrounding infection, to lose the solid sense of things. Time was slipping away as days and days were spent over the reduction of unimportant castles. He had lost sight of his main purpose, and while he was playing with time, his strength was dwindling. Under the combined influences of casualties, desertions, and disease, his army was melting away. At last, he found himself back in Dublin, far from the real force of the enemy, and with the number of men under his command diminished by one-half. Then the mist of illusion melted, and he was faced with a deplorable truth. At this late hour, with his weakened army, was it possible any longer to make sure of crushing Tyrone? He received a letter from Elizabeth. She could not imagine what could be the explanation of his conduct. If sickness of the army be the reason, why was not action taken when the army was in better state? If winters approach, why were the summer months of July and August lost? Essex contacted Tyrone's army, which, though it outnumbered his own, refused to give battle. Then Tyrone cleverly sent a messenger demanding a parley. Essex agreed. The two men met alone on horseback at a ford in a river, while the armies watched from either bank. Tyrone offered a truce to continue for 6-week periods and not to be broken without a fortnight's warning. Essex agreed. The campaign was at an end. All was over. The grand expedition had dwindled down to a futile humiliation, an indefinite suspension of hostilities. Essex had played all his cards now, and played them as badly as possible. He decided that there was only one thing that could save the situation. He must see the Queen. So, at 10 o'clock at night, muddy and disordered, Essex burst into Elizabeth's chambers, where she sat among her ladies, unpainted and in a dressing gown. Understandably, the Queen was angry, and the next day committed Essex to the custody of the Lord Keeper. When Essex sent John Harrington to intervene with the Queen, she exclaimed, "By God's son, you are all idle knaves, and Essex is worse. Who gave him command to come here so soon? I did send him on other business. And she and Francis Bacon began a confidential dialogue in which the fate of Essex was the central issue. Bacon was of the opinion that Essex was a mischievous person whose activities were dangerous to the state. She decided she would bring him to justice. She would justify her treatment of Essex before the world by having a statement of his delinquencies read out by the council in the Star Chamber. Next day, the Star Chamber met, and the statement of the Earl's misdoings was read aloud.
Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, has mismanaged the Irish operations. He has made a disgraceful treaty with Tyrone, and he has returned to England contrary to the Queen's express orders.
The effect upon Essex was appalling. He became like one possessed. He raved in fury. On one occasion, something was said in his presence of Her Majesty's conditions. Essex retorted, "Her conditions? Her conditions are as crooked as her carcass." These intolerable words reached Elizabeth, and she never recovered from them. He was declared a traitor, whereupon his supporters rallied, freed him from house arrest, and stormed the city. After a brief parley, Essex surrendered and was taken to the Tower. Elizabeth gave orders that Essex should be put on trial immediately, and he was found guilty of treason, much the same way Anne Boleyn had been found guilty. His favor had fallen, and now his enemies stepped in to destroy him. Elizabeth's feelings were not so simple. She saw plainly that she could never trust him, that the future would always repeat the past. But after all, might she not take the risk? She had been a gambler all her life. Let him do his worst. She would be equal to it. Then the terrible, outrageous words echoed in her mind. Crooked. Carcass. While he was pouring out his sugared adorations, he loathed her, despised her, recoiled from her. He had betrayed her in every possible way, mentally, emotionally, materially, as a queen and as a woman. She felt her father's spirit within her, and she condemned her lover to her mother's death. The trial had taken place on February the 19th, and the execution was fixed for the 25th. And there, on the morning of February 25th, 1601, Essex appeared in a black cloak. He spoke long and earnestly and confessed his sins. Then turning, he bowed low before the block, put his head sideways, and said, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The headsman whirled up the axe and crashed it downwards. Elizabeth resisted the first onslaughts of rage and grief, but an inevitable reaction followed. She would shut herself up in a darkened room in paroxysms of weeping. She sat alone amidst emptiness and ashes, bereft of the one thing in the whole world that was worth having. With deep sighs and mourning gestures, she constantly repeated the name of Essex. Shortly before her death, 2 years later, she announced before Commons, "To be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it."